My sister hijacked my graduation party, humiliated me with lies, and months later was dragged out of court in handcuffs screaming my name. Claudia, my sister, has been unkind to me for as long as I can remember. As kids, she once tore the head off my favorite stuffed bunny while looking me straight in the eye and said, "Now it's realistic. Bunnies die." If I received new clothes, she would take them without asking, return them dirty or stretched, and laugh at my reaction. On my 10th birthday, my mom gave me a necklace I had wanted for months. The next day, during an argument, Claudia flushed it down the toilet and then gaslit me by saying, "You probably lost it. You're always careless." School wasn't better. She made up stories about me, told embarrassing lies to my crushes, and insulted me in front of her friends. If I earned good grades, she accused me of trying to make her look bad. If I struggled, my mom would call me slow. My parents dismissed it all as normal sibling rivalry, telling us to get along because one day you'll only have each other. But I quickly realized Claudia didn't want to get along. She wanted to embarrass and humiliate me. By high school, I had learned to avoid her, but she kept pushing. When I joined the debate team and started winning, she called me a desperate nerd, trying to look important. When I got accepted into my dream college, she sneered, "Don't get too excited. You still probably fail and come back." I was looking forward to my high school graduation celebration. It wasn't just about the party. It was about finally enjoying something I had worked hard for without Claudia overshadowing it. My parents allowed me to host it in our backyard. I invited friends, teachers, and relatives. I spent weeks planning fairy lights, a taco bar, and a playlist I'd curated myself. Of course, Claudia wasn't happy. She started with passive-aggressive comments. Why does she get such a big party? I didn't. She had, but she hadn't liked parties back then. It's just high school. Nobody cares. I'm going to be bored. I told her, if you can't be nice, stay out of the way. She smirked and said, "Don't worry, I'll make it memorable." That should have been my warning. At first the party went well, then Claudia acted. She cranked the music to ear-splitting levels, playing songs she knew I disliked. When I asked her to stop, she loudly told the guests, "Oh, sorry. I didn't know the party dictator was here." Later, while everyone was eating, she accidentally spilled Coke all over the dessert table, ruining the cake, cupcakes, and fruit display I had worked hard on. Her sarcastic apology, "Oops, my bad. Guess we're dieting today." But the worst part came next. While I was speaking with my old English teacher, Claudia grabbed the microphone to give an uninvited speech. She began sharing humiliating stories, some exaggerated, others completely false. She peed her pants in middle school. She cried for an hour because I ate her cookie. Don't worry, she'll be a great college student if she can survive without mom packing her lunch. Guests laughed awkwardly, while my face burned. I tried to take the microphone, but she pulled it away. I snapped and told her to leave. She rolled her eyes. "Relax. It's just a joke. You're so sensitive." Then she walked off. The damage was done. The mood of my celebration was ruined. People tried to comfort me, but all I could think was, she did it again. She couldn't let me have one day. After that, I cut her off. I ignored her texts, calls, and her half apology. "Sorry if you took it the wrong way." For 6 months she pretended nothing had happened. At family dinners, she'd sit next to me and ask about school like we were close. If I ignored her, she'd say, "Wow, still holding a grudge. Get over it." At Thanksgiving, she made one last jab. "You're acting like I ruined your wedding. It was just a high school party." I replied, "It was my celebration. You ruined it on purpose. You've been tearing me down my whole life, and I'm done." I meant it. I stopped inviting her to events. I left family group chats. I told my parents, if she's there, I'm not. Immediately the guilt trips began. Last week my mom called saying Claudia was ready to talk, Without telling me, she put Claudia on speaker. Claudia's first words: "So, are you done being dramatic?" I hung up and threw my phone across my dorm room. My hands shook as I picked it up and blocked Claudia's number for the 15th time that week. 20 minutes later, my roommate knocked on my door, looking unsettled. She showed me Instagram messages from 3 new profiles created within the last hour, sending long texts claiming I was mentally ill and needed help. The usernames were random numbers, but the writing was unmistakably Claudia's. My roommate watched me take screenshots and save them to the evidence folder I'd created on my laptop. The next morning at the cafeteria, she sat across from me and cautiously asked if any of Claudia's claims were true. I showed her the video Elisa had recorded at my graduation party, the entire speech and my attempt to grab the mic. Her expression shifted from confusion to alarm. She said my sister was deeply troubled and asked if I had told anyone. That afternoon, I went to the college counseling center. I stared at the intake form, hovering over the box for family trauma, before finally checking it. 3 days later, I sat in Dr. Morrow's office, telling her about the bunny, the necklace, and the graduation party. She listened quietly, then said something that lifted a weight off me. It wasn't sibling rivalry. It was systematic emotional abuse. That night, Albert found me crying in the common room, after my father left a voicemail accusing me of tearing the family apart. I told Albert everything. He held me and said, "No wonder you flinch when people raise their voices." Later that week, I was scrolling through old family photos. In each one, Claudia was either smirking at the camera or doing something to hurt me, pulling my hair, grabbing my arm, stepping on my foot, while everyone else smiled. How had no one noticed? A week later, I was studying when someone pounded on my door. My mother stood there with Claudia behind her. Mom said we'd talk it out like adults, and tried to push past me. I blocked the doorway and told them to leave. Claudia screamed. I was overly emotional and selfish. My aura arrived, asked if I was okay, and I told her they needed to go. Claudia yelled she had every right to be there as my sister. Campus security came and escorted them out, while Claudia shouted the whole time. The next day, I met with University Legal Services, who helped me file a no trespass order. They said if Claudia's behavior escalated, I could apply for a restraining order. That evening, Elisa called sounding tired. Claudia had been telling everyone I'd had a mental breakdown and was making up stories for attention. Old classmates were messaging Elisa for updates. She defended me but admitted Claudia was convincing. 2 weeks later, back in Dr. Morrow's office, she handed me articles on narcissistic abuse, gaslighting, public humiliation, playing the victim. It all made sense. I wasn't crazy or oversensitive. I was angry, and for the first time, that felt justified. 2 days later, in economics class, my phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. My father's voice was weary. Claudia had been crying for weeks, and her therapist recommended family reunification. I recognized the manipulation, but it still hurt. That afternoon, Albert helped me lock down my social media. We created new accounts with fake names, maximum privacy, and blocked anyone connected to Claudia. Each block felt like another brick in the wall, separating me from my past. Midterms and papers kept me busy. Thanksgiving approached. My parents called often, promising Claudia would be at her boyfriend's dinner in Chicago, and that I'd be safe at home. Against my instincts, I drove 3 hours back, telling myself it was just 2 days. I froze as soon as I walked in and saw Claudia at the table with her familiar sneer. My mother came out of the kitchen, saying we needed to hash this out. I turned around, got back in my car, and drove to Aunt Susan's house 20 minutes away. Susan, surprised but welcoming, made coffee as I sat at her table. Over store-bought pumpkin pie, I told her everything, starting with the graduation party and working back through years of mistreatment. Her expression darkened with each story until she put down her fork and said she had always wondered why I was so quiet at family gatherings. The drive back to college was slow with holiday traffic. When I finally got to my dorm at midnight, I saw my door slightly ajar, even though I'd locked it. Nothing was stolen, but everything felt off. My diary was on a different shelf. My laptop, which I'd left closed, was open. My dresser drawers weren't shut all the way. My skin crawled as I searched the room for signs someone had touched everything. Campus security took a report, but without proof of forced entry or theft, they could only offer increased patrols. 3 days later, I returned to Dr. Marrow's office to explain what had happened. She helped me recognize the escalation in Claudia's behavior, explaining that losing control over me was making her increasingly desperate. We spent the hour creating a detailed safety plan, including emergency contacts, documentation, strategies, and specific routines for different situations. On my way back from that appointment, my phone buzzed with an email from an unfamiliar address. It contained old Instagram photos I had deleted months ago, altered to look compromising, with my face placed on other bodies in provocative poses. The message was short, but the writing style was unmistakably Claudia's, along with a threat to send the images to my professors. I went directly to campus police, who treated the blackmail seriously, and brought in a cybercrime detective. She explained that blackmail is a felony, and that they could trace IP addresses. An official investigation began that afternoon with case numbers and evidence logs. A week later, while studying in the library, my mother called in distress, yelling that Claudia had told her I was trying to have her arrested for nothing. She demanded I drop the charges, claiming I was ruining my sister's future over minor sibling disagreements. I hung up before she finished. Albert had been watching everything unfold and mentioned my situation during a video call with his parents. His mother, a social worker, encouraged me to spend winter break at their home near Cleveland. 2 weeks later, when I arrived, she sat with me in the living room and quietly validated my experience. The first time an adult had supported me without excuses or pressure to reconcile. When I returned to campus after winter break, the nightmares started immediately. I dreamt of Claudia standing at my dorm room door, sitting at the back of my classes, or waiting outside my job at the campus bookstore. They felt so real that I'd wake at 3 a.m., checking my lock 3 or 4 times before I could sleep again. My roommate grew concerned as I repeatedly got up at night to ensure the door and windows were secure. The lack of rest made everything harder, but I couldn't stop checking. 2 weeks into the semester, Elisa sent me screenshots that made my stomach drop. Claudia had been emailing our high school friends on Facebook with a fabricated story that I had stolen money from our parents and developed drug problems in college. She claimed I was begging relatives for money to support my habits, and that this was why I had cut her off. Elisa said most people didn't believe it, but some were beginning to ask questions. I was in the library trying to focus on chemistry homework when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. It was the detective handling my case with news that made me drop my head onto the desk. They had traced the blackmail emails to a coffee shop 3 blocks from Claudia's apartment. Security footage showed her at her laptop at the exact times the emails were sent. The investigator said they now had enough evidence to file charges. The next day, I met with the prosecutor at the downtown courthouse. She explained that Claudia would be arrested, arraigned, and likely offered a plea deal since this was her first offense. Then she said something I had been dreading. 3 days later, during my economics class, my phone vibrated non-stop. In the hallway, I saw 5 missed calls from my mother. When I called back, she was shouting so loudly I had to hold the phone away. She accused me of being evil, destroying the family, and said I couldn't be her daughter if I went through with this. My father then took the phone, speaking in a cold, flat tone. A week later, I sat in the back of the courtroom, Albert on one side and Dr. Morrow on the other. My palms shook as I watched them bring Claudia in for arraignment. As the prosecutor predicted, she pled not guilty, and the judge released her on bail with a no-contact order. As she left the courtroom with her lawyer, she turned and mouthed something I could hear clearly from across the room. That afternoon, Aunt Susan called. As I walked back to my dorm, she had been speaking with cousins and other family members I hadn't seen in years. She discovered that Claudia had treated several of them poorly, especially younger relatives, but they had been too afraid or embarrassed to speak up. Susan was compiling a record of behavior dating back to our childhood. The stress made it hard to focus on school. Despite the no-contact order, I kept looking over my shoulder in class. My chemistry grade fell from an A to a C in 3 weeks, and I couldn't focus long enough to read a single textbook page. Dr. Marrow formally diagnosed me with PTSD and suggested we meet twice a week to help me cope. 2 weeks after the arraignment, I was doing laundry in my dorm basement when I saw 3 new voicemails from my mother's number. My heart raced because she never left voicemails. When I played the first one, it wasn't my mother's voice. The prosecutor added witness intimidation charges the next morning when I handed over the recordings. At an emergency hearing that afternoon, the judge revoked Claudia's bail. I stood on the courthouse steps, watching through the glass doors as 2 officers led my sister away in handcuffs, her hands behind her back. I waited for guilt or sadness to surface, but all I felt was relief, like I could finally breathe after weeks of tension. The next morning, a courier delivered a thick envelope from Brennan Hayes & Associates, one of Columbus's most expensive law firms. My hands shook as I opened the letter, which urged me to reconsider, warning against permanently damaging family ties and implying I could face legal action for defamation. Albert found me still holding the letter 20 minutes later and immediately called the prosecutor's office. They reassured us this was a standard intimidation tactic. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about how my parents were spending thousands to protect the person who had harmed me my whole life. A week later, Dr. Morrow spent an entire afternoon helping me write my victim impact statement. Every sentence felt like pulling glass from a wound. I wrote about the bunny, the necklace, the ruined graduation party, and the years of smaller harms that built up to 20 years of misery. She guided me when words failed, sitting quietly as I cried through the sections, describing how Claudia had stolen my childhood and tried to damage my future. That same week, Albert's mother officially invited me to stay with them for the summer, saying their guest room was ready. Claudia had gone from cruel sibling to criminal defendant quickly, breaking into dorms, creating fake images, and committing cybercrimes. Albert's mother told me about her own sister and how cutting ties with toxic relatives had allowed her to rebuild. She said chosen family can be stronger than blood. I accepted their offer, feeling like I had finally found steady ground after months of upheaval. Elisa testified in a deposition the following Tuesday, showing the prosecutor and Claudia's lawyer the graduation party video frame by frame. The prosecutor later told me it strongly demonstrated a pattern of public humiliation and harassment, especially when Claudia seized the microphone as I tried to stop her. 2 weeks later, I was helping Albert's mother prepare dinner when we heard pounding on the front door and my mother shouting that she knew I was inside. Albert's mother told me to stay in the kitchen while she answered, but I heard everything as Marlene pushed past her, demanding to see me. When I entered the living room, my mother's face turned red as she yelled about Claudia facing prison and asked if that's what I wanted. When I didn't answer, she crossed the room and slapped me hard across the face. Albert's mother immediately called 911, while my mother continued yelling about family loyalty. Police arrived within 10 minutes and arrested her for assault as I stood there with Albert's mother's arm around me, my cheek still stinging. At the station, I filed another report. The detective explained that family violence often intensifies during legal proceedings, which didn't make it easier to watch my own mother being handcuffed. The next day, I returned to my old home while my parents were at work to collect a few belongings. I sat in my childhood bedroom for the last time, remembering how Claudia had smashed my jewelry box, torn my posters, and stolen my diary to read aloud to her friends. I left most of it behind, taking only some photos and my debate medals before locking the door on that chapter of my life. A month later, the prosecutor called to say Claudia had been offered a plea deal, 2 years probation, mandatory therapy, and a permanent restraining order. I found it reasonable, but Claudia refused, insisting on going to trial because she wanted to tell her side. The prosecutor explained that narcissists often do this to gain attention and play the victim publicly. 3 days after that call, a package arrived at Albert's house with no return address. Inside was my old plush bunny from when I was 5, its head reattached with black thread. The note read, "Fixed it for you, signed Mom." It felt more like a warning than an apology. Meanwhile, Aunt Susan had been gathering evidence from my parents' attic, building a 20-year timeline. She found old-school report cards, noting my withdrawn and anxious behavior around my sister. I found journals I thought were lost, and photos of me flinching away from Claudia as a toddler. The pattern had always been there, written in different handwriting by teachers, counselors, and coaches who sensed something was wrong but never put it all together. 2 months later, I decided to do something on campus. I never thought I'd have the courage to try. I reserved a small room at the student center and distributed flyers for a support group for students who had experienced family abuse. At the first meeting, I sat with my notebook and 3 chairs in a circle, waiting nervously to see if anyone would come. Ashley arrived first, then Ben, followed by another student named Kay. We spent most of that first hour in silence, but by the end Ashley was crying as she spoke about her stepfather, and Ben shared stories of his older brother locking him in closets. By the 4th meeting, our group had grown to 12 members, and we needed a bigger space. The following week, the prosecutor called to inform me that the trial was scheduled for 6 months away. I tried to focus on classes, but when the official notice came saying I'd have to testify, I immediately got sick in my dorm. Albert stayed with me, while Dr. Marrow reassured me in our next session that I had already endured the hardest part. Not long after, I ran into Mrs. Chelsea, a family friend, at a grocery store near campus. She hugged me and told me how much my mother missed me, adding that she looked terrible without me around. Guilt hit me hard, and I abandoned my shopping cart before leaving in tears. 2 weeks later, Claudia's lawyer filed a motion claiming I was mentally unstable and that my testimony should be thrown out. They demanded full access to my therapy records. Dr. Marrow explained that while the judge would limit what they could see, her diagnosis could still be questioned in court. Around this time, my former English teacher reached out on Facebook. She remembered finding me crying in the bathroom after Claudia humiliated me in the cafeteria years earlier, and offered to testify about what she had seen. I started writing everything in a private blog to clear my thoughts. The memories poured out like poison I had been holding in. Albert read some entries with my permission, then comforted me as I cried. A month later, my father sent me a letter through my lawyer. He wrote that he was divorcing my mother after her arrest for helping Claudia. Admitted he had failed to protect me, but still didn't want Claudia in jail. He suggested we might all go to family therapy one day. I read the letter a few times before throwing it away. Soon after, the prosecutor showed me surveillance footage. Claudia had been following me for weeks at coffee shops, the library, and parking areas, long before the blackmail began. They explained that this planning strengthened the charges. One afternoon in psychology class, I heard a laugh behind me that sounded like Claudia's. My chest tightened, and I fled the room, spending nearly an hour calming myself down using the breathing techniques Dr. Morrow had taught me. 2 weeks later, I met with Dr. Morrow for an EMDR session. She used a light bar while asking me to recall the memory of my stuffed bunny being torn apart. I broke down in tears, but afterward, the memory felt more distant, as though seen through glass rather than relived. The next day, Aunt Susan called Albert, shaken after speaking with her daughter Sophia. Sophia confessed that 6 years earlier, Claudia had secretly destroyed her wedding dress and convinced everyone it was her own breakdown. Sophia had believed it for years, but now wanted to testify. Susan apologized repeatedly for not believing me sooner. As I slowly learned to compartmentalize, my grades improved. My economics professor even offered me a research assistant position, one of the first positive developments in months. A month later, the pre-trial hearing began. Claudia's lawyer argued the matter was a family dispute, not a crime, but the judge ruled otherwise, citing evidence of premeditation and the seriousness of her actions. One morning, I saw campus security rush into the humanities building. Inside, my mother was holding a large sign reading, "Forgive your family." Security escorted her out as she shouted accusations and warnings about divine punishment. She was arrested again for violating the restraining order. Around this time, I began trial preparation with the prosecutor. She pushed me through practice questions, interrupting when I grew upset and reminding me to stick to facts. During one session, I met another woman, Ashley, in the courthouse restroom. She was crying and told me she was filing charges against her sister after 20 years of abuse. We exchanged numbers and began supporting each other. Albert later discovered a USB among my old belongings. On it were family videos where Claudia was always shown hurting me, pinching, pulling my hair, or breaking toys, while my parents filmed, oblivious to what was happening in the background. A week before the trial, Claudia's lawyer told the press that I was a troubled young woman fabricating stories. The news spread quickly online, sparking debates among former classmates. My campus support group publicly defended me by sharing their own experiences. Meanwhile, Albert's mother found therapists from Claudia's past workplaces who privately confirmed her pattern of bullying, though confidentiality prevented them from testifying. 2 weeks later, jury selection began. Several potential jurors were dismissed, including one who insisted families should always forgive each other and another who believed sibling fights were normal. The prosecutor emphasized that family members can also be abusers. Just days before trial, I broke down in a session with Dr. Morrow. I realized I had spent years hiding the truth from my parents to avoid conflict, while Claudia slowly destroyed me. The night before court, Albert and I reviewed notes in my hotel room. Later, I received a call from my father. His voice was slurred as he told me he wished I'd never been born, claiming none of this would have happened without me. Albert ended the call while I sat shaking. The next morning, Elisa arrived after flying in from California. We stayed up late looking at yearbooks, where she pointed out how often I appeared to be avoiding Claudia in photos. The first day of trial began with opening statements. Claudia sat in a conservative dress she had never worn before, dabbing her eyes like the victim. The prosecutor outlined 2 decades of escalating abuse, while Claudia's lawyer called it sibling rivalry. Footage from the graduation party was played, showing Claudia taking the microphone, which visibly unsettled some jurors despite repeated objections from her lawyer. On the second day, I was called to testify. I spoke about the stuffed bunny, the necklace flushed down the toilet, the ruined clothes, and the rumors she spread. My voice cracked only when describing how she placed the bunny's head in my school backpack. Some jurors looked visibly moved. Cross-examination followed. Claudia's lawyer accused me of jealousy, revenge, and mental instability. He tried to twist my words during cross-examination, but I calmly repeated, "That sep's not true," and stuck to the facts, just as Dr. Morrow had taught me. When asked why I waited so long to report, I explained that my parents had always dismissed it as just sister stuff. After my testimony, the prosecution called my former English teacher, Mrs. Keller. She brought her old teaching diary, which contained notes documenting several times she found me crying after interactions with Claudia. Her dated entries and observations gave the jury a written record of long-standing concerns. Next came my cousin Monica. She appeared nervous, clutching a tissue as she described Claudia's wedding 3 years earlier. The night before, Claudia had ruined her bridesmaid dress by spilling red wine on it while laughing. At the wedding, Claudia convinced everyone that Monica had destroyed it herself out of jealousy. Monica broke down as the prosecutor showed photos of the ruined dress and text messages where Claudia bragged about it. Her testimony made it clear that Claudia enjoyed causing harm, and several jurors looked unsettled. A cybercrime detective then presented evidence of Claudia's harassment. He traced abusive messages back to her devices, with timestamps showing months of constant activity. He demonstrated how Claudia created fake social media accounts, manipulated my photos, and posted them on disturbing websites. He even revealed spreadsheets she used to plan the timing of her harassment for maximum effect. During lunch break, I encountered my father. He looked older and worn down. He apologized and admitted he finally understood who Claudia really was. I didn't forgive him, but I nodded, unsure how else to respond. That afternoon, Claudia testified in her own defense. Dressed in white, she presented herself as a victim, crying as she claimed I was jealous of her and had fabricated everything for attention. At first, the jury seemed sympathetic, but when the prosecutor questioned her about the graduation video, she tried to deny it until the footage was shown. Her demeanor changed completely. Pressed further, Claudia lost control and shouted that I deserved what she had done because I always tried to make her look bad. The courtroom went silent as jurors saw her true nature. The next day, character witnesses testified. Teachers described me as a strong student who began struggling only when the harassment escalated. My manager recalled finding me crying at work, and Albert spoke about my night terrors. Elisa provided texts where I pleaded for help, understanding why Claudia was so angry. That night, I struggled to sleep, even knowing the truth. Claudia's confident lies echoed in my mind, a reminder of the years of gaslighting that made me doubt myself. On the 5th day, closing arguments began. The prosecutor outlined Claudia's pattern of escalating behavior, supported by timelines and evidence. Stressing her lack of remorse, the defense argued it was family dysfunction, not criminal behavior, and pushed against prison time. While the jury deliberated, my family and I waited in the corridor. Aunt Susan told me I had already won by breaking free, though I wasn't sure I believed it. 2 hours later, chaos broke out at the courthouse entrance. My mother, Marlene, had shown up again in violation of her restraining order. She yelled at reporters and tried to reach me, accusing me of destroying the family. Security restrained her, and she was arrested once more. The following morning, the prosecutor informed us that the jury had requested to review the graduation video and cybercrime evidence, showing they were taking the case seriously. I could barely eat or drink, but Dr. Morrow reassured me that no matter the outcome, I had already reclaimed my life. For the first time, I realized she was right. I was no longer afraid of Claudia. The next day, the jury returned. My hands shook as we entered the courtroom. The verdict: guilty on all counts, including harassment, blackmail, and witness intimidation. Claudia's face shifted from smugness to anger in seconds. Then, in a sudden outburst, she lunged across the defense table toward me, screaming. Court officers restrained her, and the judge added contempt of court to her charges. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, with prosecutors estimating 2 to 5 years in prison. Outside the courthouse, I gave a short statement expressing hope that my case would encourage other survivors to seek justice, even against family members. At Albert's home that evening, I finally released the emotions I had held in, while his family quietly supported me. The following week, my support group held a small celebration. One member told me I had given them hope to confront their own abusers. Not long after, I received a letter and a check from my father, Aiden, restoring my education fund. He wrote that he had left Marlene filed for divorce, and entered therapy, acknowledging his failures but working to change. 6 weeks later, Claudia was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by probation and mandatory psychological treatment. A permanent restraining order was issued, barring her from contacting me or coming near me after release. In therapy, I realized I wasn't mourning the loss of my family. I was mourning the family I should have had. Marlene later sent a legal notice disowning me, cutting me from her will. Albert and Elisa came over that evening, and we burned the letter together in the backyard. Watching it turn to ash was freeing. 2 months later, I legally changed my last name to Smith, Albert's mother's maiden name. His family had treated me as one of their own, and the name change felt like breaking free from lifelong chains. Returning to campus for sophomore year, everything was different. My grades thrived. I secured the research position I wanted, and the support group grew from 5 to over 30 members. Trauma no longer defined me. That Thanksgiving, Aunt hosted a gathering with Albert's family and the cousin who testified. For the first time, I experienced a holiday filled with peace and gratitude. Later, I shared an anonymous article about sibling abuse in the university paper. Dozens of students reached out with their own stories, and I started weekly meetups to support them. In December, Dr. Morrow noted that I hadn't mentioned Claudia in weeks, and I realized the fear was gone. By spring, Albert and I moved into a small apartment near campus, planning our future without fear. My phone stayed silent. No threats, no manipulation, no guilt. Surrounded by people who cared for me, I finally felt safe. For the first time since childhood, I truly felt free.